Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is the market revolution. And the biggest change, the most significant change in the market revolution, has to do with the way that things were created. And the biggest change here is that people stopped making things themselves and instead they started to buy and sell things that they needed. Now, what we mean by this is before you would make everything that you possibly could at home. Whether it was made out of wood, usually perhaps stone. But the idea is that you didn't really buy many things. You would make almost literally almost everything you possibly could. Well, what happens in the market revolution is that people start to differentiate, I should say, what they produce. And instead of actually making everything, you make one, maybe several goods, you make them very well, and you start to sell those, and in turn, you can trade those things for either money or for other goods. Now, the biggest thing, or I guess the biggest result out of this, is that you started to see the growth of factories. And factories, of course, are the massive areas that produce things on an incredibly large scale. But the main thing of the market revolution is that it created a marketplace where now instead of producing everything, you are actually buying and selling. Free enterprise. This is what we have, a system that we have in the United States. And as you see, it says a system where there are few rules. It doesn't mean that there's no rules. There are still rules, but the idea is that the minimum amount of rules is better under free enterprise. The people who are in support of this say that any sort of rules or regulations, all that does is serve to interfere with business and interfere with the profit that businesses are making. The other side, of course, is that without rules and regulations, then the working conditions, prices, and quality, all sorts of things like this would suffer greatly. And so it tends to be a balance. How much regulation do we need, and how much should business thrive without those regulations? So it is a continuing balancing act. An entrepreneur, someone who starts their own business. Many successful entrepreneurs. Facebook CEO might even be one of them. Started his business and now it's worth 50, $60 billion or something like that. But of course, it's important to know not every entrepreneur is successful. Oftentimes, there's lots of failures until finally you hit it right on what you intended, and then hopefully success. This is Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph, which we obviously don't use anymore. But when it existed, it literally shortened the distance between people because now you could get a message literally in seconds from one side of the country to the other, as opposed to having to wait for a person to travel, which would be many days at least. And so it really was something that changed society dramatically by allowing the flow of information to increase. The textile mills, all the way up here in Lowell, Massachusetts. As you can see, it's right outside of Boston. And this area is famous for being a massive producer of textiles, meaning cloth that eventually would be turned into clothing. The working conditions weren't so great, but it did in fact employ women, which was something that at the time, well, I wouldn't say unheard of, but certainly was not usual. Strike. Well, this is when workers are protesting because they have poor wages or working conditions. Strikes really tend not to benefit both parties, and so both parties really do try to avoid it. And it really is the last resort. You can't just wake up one day and say, hey, we're on strike. You have to go through a very long process. It's a legal process. And really, it really is the last resort. But the workers feel that there's nothing else they can do. So they stop working until their demands are either met or they can compromise on those demands. It's become more of a rare thing these days, but there were times, certainly in the 1800s, where striking was far more popular. And these days, not as much as days in past, but these days it's not associated so much with violence. But in the past, strikes usually had a bad reputation for, bad things happening, violence breaking out, fights breaking out, and things of that nature. Immigration, of course, this has been in the news for quite some time now. Um, I guess one's view on immigration is dependent on your political view, but certainly the United States is a nation of immigrants, and I'm certain that almost every single person in this class is an immigrant. I know I certainly am. My great grandparents came from Ukraine and landed in New York City. So unless you're Native American, you are an immigrant. And an interesting thing, the United States would actually be losing population. We don't have enough children being born to maintain our population. So without immigration, we would be losing population, which of course is terrible for the economy. Trade unions, national trade union, it's just an organization, and most unions really are, especially, they're just organizations that fought for better wages and better working conditions. And unions seem to be dying out, but perhaps that will change. Commonwealth versus Hunt, and this is just a Supreme Court case supporting labor unions. Anytime you see the V and all this stuff in the italics, that means that it is a court case. Okay, that is it for today.